Hello and welcome. In today's video, I'd like to continue our conversation about a high performance mindset. What is it? Why should you care? And how can you develop it? We look at the key elements and we start with the first one, knowing your why. So we've known your why and setting smart goals sort of dealt with. And today I want to look at a new area of learning. And specifically, I want to look at feedback. I came across a really good article called Avoiding the Feedback Monsters, Using Behavioural Insights to Develop a Strong Feedback Culture, written by Todd Finesca and Timothy Murphy back in 2017. And they were working with, Deloitte. But really good article, and I'm going to use that as a basis for today's conversation. So let's just start. Feedback. Well, we all know it's the breakfast of champions, and we know it's a key element of high performance mindset. And I want you to just reflect for a moment on any top performer you know, be it in business, politics, sport, education, the arts, whatever. What do they all have in common? Well, what they all have in common is they have a coach. They have people who support them, who train them, who develop them. They don't try to do it alone. There's a really good book written by Bill Bonser, the founder of TTI, called If I Knew Then What I Know Now. And I really just love the title, wonderful title. And of course, one of the very important things that we can do is identify what we don't know. And in knowing what we don't know, we can then learn and grow. And feedback is very hard to give and it's very hard to receive. And having models can be really helpful in doing this, in giving and receiving feedback. And one of my favourite models is the Johari window, just to explain to people what's going on. And if you look at this model, you can see quite clearly that what we're trying to do is we're trying to squeeze the bottom right hand quadrant. So by disclosing more of ourselves, we push down the line, and by asking for feedback, we move over the line and we squeeze down that unknown area. Really nice little representation here of that model. So we want to expand the open free area, and we can't do it on our own. So think about this. If you think that you don't know what you don't know, and if you want to improve your performance, if you want to develop a high performance mentality or a high performance mindset, you absolutely must get feedback. You won't learn and grow on your own, or will take you a long time. So feedback is truly the breakfast of champions. And I should add, there's a strong business case to be made for developing a culture of coaching, a culture of feedback. A 21% boost in business results according to a Deloitte report. And that's quite remarkable. And also in a Harvard Business Review study, there was a direct correlation between employees who average in the bottom quarter of the population in terms of organizational commitment, satisfaction, desire to stay engaged, and so on, and those who ranked leaders lowest at providing quality feedback. So it's really important, and clearly has a direct impact on your organization, not just on yourself. So the question is, how do we actually develop feedback? And I want to start by popping up this model here from that paper I mentioned, and called How Feedback is Given and Received. And this is a really good representation of what's actually happening. And what's interesting about it is, I think, this may not be what you actually expect. Research suggests that effective feedback should be offered in a manner that incorporates the belief system and intentions of the giver and the receiver. And this is really important. I'm going to be talking about congruence in a while, and this is all about congruence and about removing bias. Absent these considerations, feedback is likely to be a frightening experience and fall on deaf ears. And it can be a frightening experience not just for the receiver, but for the giver. And so these elements up here that you're seeing here on this graphic are the key factors that exist in any feedback discussion. So here are the 4 elements of effective feedback: the giver's inner dialogue, the non-verbal communication, the verbal communication, and the receiver's inner dialogue. So the first one, the giver's inner dialogue. And this is really interesting. We're talking about the belief that the giver has about the receiver and his or her abilities and or character. And also about the giver's current emotional disposition. The non-verbal communication, we're talking about body language, tone, and especially facial expression between the giver and the receiver. The verbal communication, obviously the spoken words, is what we're talking about here. But interestingly, this may get the least attention of the four elements and can be the least impactful. And the last one, the receiver's inner dialogue. So the receiver's belief about themselves, their belief about the feedback giver, the feedback itself, their belief about the feedback itself, and their belief about the situation. So here are the four elements of feedback, and it's really, really important to get your head around these four as the key elements that you need to be aware of in the whole feedback scenario. And I really want to just talk a moment about this thing of the FAE, fundamental attribution error. This is a common bias that people have, and describes the tendency of people to judge others' actions as being a result of their fundamental disposition or character. So they are behaving because that's the kind of person they are. While we ourselves, our actions aren't a function of our character, but because of situational factors. So when we do something, it's not because that's the kind of person we are, it's because, well, this is the situation we're in. Whereas when somebody else does something, it's because that's the kind of person they are, that's the character they have, as opposed to that's the situation they're in. And this is a cognitive bias that we have, and it's really, really important to recognise it because it helps us in not judging the other person and in developing techniques to help somebody receive the feedback effectively. There are 4 tips for effective feedback that this paper mentions. Tip number 1. Accentuate the positive, reduce the negative. Tip number 2, be attuned to micro expressions, both yours and the other person's. Tip number 3, appreciate, coach and evaluate. And tip number 4, use containment charts to get feedback and videos to train for feedback. So let's go through them one by one. So I mentioned this FAE, this cognitive bias that we have. And if we approach the situation where we are thinking of how we can help the person, that's not about their character, it's about a situation, it really helps. So for example, the case that's given in the paper is a basketball coach. So instead of telling the person you're unable to drive for the hoop straight away, you don't focus on that. Say, let me teach you how to do sideways dribbles. So what you're saying is attacking the hoop doesn't work for you, but you're not actually saying that. You're saying, let's practice improving something, i.e. your sideways dribbles, that can get you to the hoop, but by a different route. So what you're doing is, this is a lens of building a skill or helping somebody build a skill. So when they come across a similar situation in the future, they can apply this learning to that situation. So in our world of organizations, a good example would be as follows. Somebody produces a slide deck. There's too much content in it, too much verbiage, too busy, there's just too much going on. So instead of saying to them the slides are too busy, too much verbiage on it, too many things happening there, you might just say, perhaps you're very, very good at graphics. We could simplify the slides and only have graphics that represent what you want to say, and you can focus on those. One other item on accentuating the positive and reducing the negative. The non-verbals are really, really important here. In one study where people were shown videos of feedback sessions, they assigned 13 times more to the non-verbals than to the verbals. So if somebody was giving negative feedback, that was the actual non-verbals that were going on there, like the tone of voice, the body language and so on. That was 13 times more important when they were reviewing these than were the verbals. So you realise the importance of these things as you're giving the positive and reducing the negative. It's very, very important that it all hang together. And that brings me into tip number 2, be attuned to micro expressions, both yours and the other person's. And this cannot be overemphasized. Facial expressions particularly. People will be, and even by the way, when people can't see your facial expressions, they're still tuned into you. But facial expressions are hugely important. So there's a need for congruence between your facial expressions, which you're not even aware quite often that you're displaying, and what you're saying. And again, getting back to this thing of the FAE and removing this cognitive bias we mentioned, if you think the person is somehow wrong, there's something wrong with them, well, that would be manifest in your facial expressions. So you need to reposition your thinking and remove that bias by thinking about the actual behavior, the thing that you want to actually change, and saying it's situational and how can I teach a skill to help the person actually improve in that regard. And then your facial expressions should be congruent with the words that you're actually saying. And where they are congruent, it really builds trust and allows the receiver to receive the feedback in a much more positive way. Research has shown there are about 7 facial expressions. And what's interesting about these can be learned, and these are, just read them out to you, happiness, sadness, anger, disgust, fear, contempt, and surprise. And you can really master, and that might be an interesting first place to start for you in terms of giving feedback. See, can you actually pay attention to the person's face and see what's going on and understand what's going on by the micro expressions on their face. And as a consequence, change the dialogue, change what you're saying, change the approach that you're taking. Also very important in this area is the positive to negative ratio. And research has shown that it's something in the order of 6-1. And I'm not just talking about 6-1. We all know we say something nice before you say something not nice. We're talking about you need to say at least 6 things, or do at least 6 things, or express at least 6 things. And you can't fake it. Remember again, the micro expressions, the way it all hangs together, it has to be congruent. You have to have a ratio of about 6-1, positive to negative, in terms of feedback. And interestingly, research has shown that this is the exact same for relationships, for romantic relationships, for divorce, that the ratio has to be about 6-1 for successful relationships, and when it's less than 6-1, there's a risk of divorce. Tip number 3, appreciate, coach and evaluate. Appreciation is by its very nature a positive thing for somebody who's receiving it. And it really builds this sense of intrinsic motivation. So when somebody's is showing appreciation, it raises their level of motivation and engagement. It's a really, really important, you know the expression, I don't care what you know until I know that you care. It's a very good example. When you show appreciation of somebody, it's the same kind of thing. When they feel this, it raises intrinsic motivation and allows them to be receptive to feedback. And coaching is very, very helpful, especially with helping somebody reach their ideal self. And again, to coach effectively, you have to remove this cognitive bias we talked about, and frame things in your own mind so that you're focused on skills and learning and developing the individual, as opposed to judging them as a character with a flaw. Evaluation, of course, is the trickiest, because evaluation, typically we're measuring something, and it's very hard to practice. We've just said when we're talking about a number, you did it or you didn't do it. But what you can do when you're giving feedback in terms of evaluation against a target, for example, is you can focus the effort on how does one develop the skills, how can one improve in the future, what can one practically do, as opposed to focusing specifically on the target. It doesn't mean you don't acknowledge that the target was missed or that the number wasn't achieved. You acknowledge that, but then the focus moves on to, okay, what can we do now? What's the next steps? How can we build skills, and so on? For example, why was the target missed? What specifically can we do? Was there a particular area that we didn't focus on? Specific steps that weren't taken? What specifically can we do? What training is required to improve performance going forward so that in fact the target will be achieved next time round? So we're focusing on things the person can control, things the person can do, as opposed to trying to just focus on the specific number. Tip number 4 They use containment charts to give feedback and videos to train for feedback. This is sort of interesting. A containment chart is sort of interesting to help somebody understand what feedback is all about. And what feedback isn't about. An example here is, I need to increase the amount I published. Well, that's so the researcher isn't publishing enough, or the university professor isn't publishing enough. Well, that's what it's about, as opposed to I'm not a good researcher. I need to focus more on my time on publishing my results, as opposed to I can't write well, and so on. And what you're trying to do there is help the individual frame in advance. They've actually framed what the feedback is and is not about. And by doing that, it allows them to be more receptive to feedback. Regarding training for feedback, videos have proven to be very, very successful in training for feedback. So for example, recording a feedback session and then allowing the receiver to watch that feedback session on that recording later. It's sort of the detachment, and they observe the feedback differently, and they're more receptive and more open to the feedback when they watch the recording, because they're not there feeling they have to defend themselves or feeling threatened or whatever. They can watch it in a more objective manner. So in terms of training for feedback, watching feedback like that on video is a very, very good process. Not always easy to do, of course, but a good tool if you wish. So, in summary, the 4 key elements of effective feedback. Giver's inner dialogue. So avoid this FAE by staying positive and ensuring your beliefs around the receiver are not based on your view of some innate character issue. You're more focused on the situation. Understand the receiver's career ideal self, or whatever situation it is, but what their ideal self is, and believe and frame the feedback as skill building to achieve the ideal self, as opposed to you wagging a finger at them. The non-verbals. Believe what you're saying, because if you don't, it will most likely show in your non-verbals, particularly in the micro-expressions on your face. And the person will pick up on those cues. And remember, even when they can't see those cues, somehow or other, we connect mentally and we pick up on them. Learn to identify and respond to more micro-expressions. And as I said earlier, that might be a good place to actually start, to observe people you're giving feedback to and see, can you spot the micro-expressions on their face and become aware of them, and then respond appropriately and change what you're saying appropriately. Verbal communication. Recall the importance of the 6-to-1 positive to negative ratio. So you really need to think about that very, very carefully. How do you do that? I consider providing 4 or 5 appreciative or coaching comments for each evaluative comment. And then receiver's inner dialogue. By incorporating these sort of feedback containment charts to disassociate emotions from the message, to show them, hang on a second, this is what we're reviewing, this is not what they're reviewing, because people misinterpret very, very quickly. So separating those two and using the containment charts to do that is really, really helpful. And then practice recording and giving the feedback to people so they can actually go and review it afterwards. And by the way, it's also interesting for you to look at this and see what you've learned in terms of the feedback that you've given as well. So that's the whole learning aspect of high performance mentality, and feedback being a key element of learning. So I hope you found this video useful, and I look forward to seeing you at the next one.